I'm a retired major crimes detective, and I've seen true evil 3 times in my career. All 3 were in the last decade of my career. I spent 12 years walking the beat before I had the opportunity to step in and assist a detective and a criminal investigator on a double homicide. Through my numerous connections from years on the streets, we managed to get several leads that led to the arrests of the guilty. I moved out of patrol and spent a decade investigating sex crimes, arsons, and armed robberies. I took advanced training seminars and workshops, studying past cases and offender modalities. I worked with the drug squads on serious assaults and the occasional murder, before finding myself stepping in for a retiring detective. I was familiar with his partner, Connolly, and we became a good team. I bring this all up to emphasize that I've seen horrific shit in my 33 years on the force. Images I'll never shake. People who still haunt my dreams. I can honestly say that most of the criminals I've put away haven't been evil. They've all been motivated by something, however benign, to commit their acts. Then there are some that are on the fence. The ones that take violent crimes further than would typically be the case. And then there are those that dream up horrific atrocities to be inflicted on the world around them. Because why not? Patty Wilson fell somewhere beyond the shades of your typical serial killer. She was the first person I encountered on the job, who I could reliably say had true evil in her. Patty was a nurse who transferred to an obstetrics and delivery clinic in one of the city's lower-class neighborhoods. This particular clinic had a terrible miscarriage and stillbirth rate, but the numbers were fudged and kept hidden. Eventually, people in the neighborhood started talking, and word got out of how many deaths there were. Our station was contacted, and normally that type of thing would land on another desk. But we were short-staffed, so Connolly and I were brought in. Our investigation led us to Patty, and we found that in her 23 years at the clinic, there'd been over 2,000 miscarriages. She'd been giving a chemical cocktail to the expectant mothers, claiming it would help with sleep. Instead, it gradually killed the fetus as it grew. We'd also discovered that after several dozen healthy births, Patty would take the baby away to be cleaned up, but would return with the horrible news that the baby had died shortly after being delivered. Our investigations into that didn't lead anywhere concrete, but one of the threads we were pulling on led us to believe Patty had been lying to the mothers, telling them their baby had died, when in fact the baby was healthy, but was shipped off to the highest bidder. A live baby on the black market could fetch a tidy sum, whether for organ harvesting, stem cells, or something more deviant and horrific. We believed it was racially motivated, as almost all the miscarriages and stillbirths occurred exclusively with black parents. But Patty denied it all. I remember watching Patty in our first interview with her. Her face was normal and moved expressively as she spoke and answered our questions. But her eyes didn't. They were empty, black holes, and the longer you stared into them, the more uncomfortable you became. Even after the trial, which had her served with multiple life sentences, Patty denied any wrongdoing. The next case where I witnessed true evil, it fractured into an investigation involving multiple events. Connolly and I were called in to investigate an attack on a beach volleyball tournament. On the city's largest beach, there was a national tournament with over 300 teams playing on 50 courts over the course of the weekend. The ages were from 12 to 65, and were both men and women. During morning warm-ups before the first game on the first day, 1 scream turned into 2 screams turned into 100 screams. Over 1/3 of the players needed immediate medical attention. Their feet, ankles, knees, thighs, hips, stomachs, and in some cases up to their shoulders and face, were covered in deep, gushing cuts. Someone had gone to the beach the night before the tournament and brought hundreds of small, flat pieces of wood with razor blades sticking up from the centers in an upside-down capital T shape. The wood was dug into the sand with the blades' sharp end pointed upward and hidden just under the surface so no one could see them. It must have taken hours to set up. There were no deaths, but the damage that was caused resulted in hundreds of injuries and several dozen athletic young adults with sliced Achilles tendons and a dwindling future in sports. As with every investigation, we started off at the crime scene and worked our way outwards in tight, concentric circles. While the CSIs were combing the beach, Connolly and I were interviewing the people who ran the tournament, looking for any enemies or people who might want to target them, and this tournament in particular. But those led nowhere. Sadly, the CSIs fared no better. The entire crime scene was awash. There were so many footprints and shoe and sandal prints in the sand, it was impossible to search for tracks. And the actual razor blades and pieces of wood had been doused in bleach before being placed in their small dugouts. There were no security cameras on the beach, and the lone one that was in the parking lot didn't capture any cars between the hours of midnight and 7 a.m. Our phones were ringing off the hook with tips, but there were no real leads. After a month, we were nowhere in the investigation. Then a new investigation came in, and our hamstrung department got even tighter. Connolly and I took it on as well. At a senior's home along the city's waterfront, a fire had started in the basement. Because of the accelerants used, it quickly overtook the first 2 floors. From there, the rest of the 8-story building went up. 22 residents and 9 staff died in the fire, all from smoke inhalation. We scoured the undamaged security footage, but again found no suspects around the parking lots or front entrances. The footage from the rear of the building was destroyed, so we couldn't check it. Then a third investigation dropped onto our desks. This time there was a mass poisoning in a junior high school cafeteria. There were 23 deaths, 15 of which were students, and over 100 severe injuries. Our investigation showed that someone had stealthily broken into the school overnight and poisoned every piece of food in the cafeteria stockroom, fridge, and freezer with arsenic. It was a miracle more people didn't die. All the school's exterior cameras were working, and after scouring them for clues, we finally found one at the back doors. The footage captured someone dressed in all black, with a hood and ski mask over his face. He'd used a small set of lockpicking tools to enter the back door, which led to the kitchen. He used the same door to exit and ran off across the soccer field towards the water. And everything made sense. The beach volleyball courts, the seniors' home, and now this junior high. They all backed out onto the water. The school itself had taken advantage of that fact by introducing students to rowing, kayaking, sailing, swimming, and other sports and activities on the open sea. And the seniors' home was partially marketed based on its incredible view of the water. We hypothesized the 3 mass crimes were committed by the same individual. We marked all 3 locations on a map and scanned down the coast for all the marinas and harbors. Then we went back through all the routes and picked out various waterfront hotspots we knew would have footage of their exteriors. Using the dates of the 3 incidents, we cross-checked the footage to try to find any repeat boats on the nights in question. We watched a lot of footage. There was only one boat that stood out. A large, older black speedboat being driven by a lone individual we couldn't make out details of. A red light glowed from inside the cabin. Connolly and I got pictures of the boat printed and went back to check the marinas and harbors. None of the docks we went to had seen the particular boat or had records of it, which made us think it was docking at a private residence. I spoke to one of my friends in narcotics named Waco, and he brought up the drug boats that had been populating the cove near the last dock we visited. It turned out that the many drug users in our city had been moving away from alleyways and SROs, and onto small dinghies and drug boats, turning them into floating pill houses. The boats were harder for cops to break up or investigate, and you could float in the cove or out in the nearby channel for up to 6 months before having to vacate. Of course, the 6-month rule was never enforced, so the cove kept getting busier with more and more drug boats. Waco offered to help. He went in one night and made his way around the 30 or so boats, which were loosely tied together. Waco found our black boat. He learned the owner was a guy people called Red. He was a dealer and let people use and pass out on board his boat afterwards. The next night, Waco went back, and we followed from a distance with the Coast Guard. We had Waco wired so we could hear everything on board. His plan was to get on with a few others to buy and use some heroin, then pass out. He would fake the shooting up part and pretend to fall asleep. Connolly and I listened in, hearing the details of the casual conversations going on from the other users as they bought and started prep. Soon enough, all the voices went quiet, including Waco's. A rough, agitated voice called out, asking if anyone was awake. There was no response. The voice belonging to Red laughed and said, "Good." We heard some shuffling. Then the engine on the boat rev into gear. The boat peeled out, leaving the cove behind. Waco had a GPS tracker in his shoe, so Connolly and I watched the boat on a monitor as it headed out to sea. We followed from a distance. The Coast Guard's lights all turned off and went completely stealth. Connolly and I continued listening in. After several minutes, the engine died down. There were sounds of chains rustling, then clanking together. Waco's voice came over the mic in a hushed and frantic whisper. "He's chaining us together. There's an anvil on one end." Our captain flipped the lights and sirens on, and the boat gunned it towards the blip on our radar. Over the mic, we heard Red notice the sirens. He started to panic and, from what Waco told us, was about to toss the anvil over the side. But Waco was up and ready to fight. He surprised Red from behind and got him in a chokehold. When we arrived, Red was unconscious on the floor of the boat, and Waco was sitting on his back. There were 5 users laying on the floor. They were all dead. Red had given them all spike batches, and they'd died minutes before. When we got back to land, interrogating Red was useless and terrifying. Useless because he said nothing. And terrifying because of how he said nothing. He'd bitten off his tongue moments before we got him in the room. He was in a hospital for the next day and a half before we sat him down with a pencil and paper. We didn't really need Red to talk, though. There was more than enough evidence to put him away for the deaths of the 5 users on the boat. And then divers found more bodies along the same stretch Red boated on. Altogether, it appeared Red was responsible for the deaths of over 50 people. And that didn't include the beach volleyball tournament, the seniors' home, or the junior high school. The thing I remembered most about my brief time sitting across from Red during this interviews were his eyes. Just like Patty. I watched his face move and twitch and wrinkle, but his eyes were always the same empty black holding my gaze. We never got a reason or motive for any of it. We found out he'd been in and out of foster homes up until his 16th birthday. Coincidentally enough, there was a house fire which killed both his foster parents and 2 other kids living there. After that, Red disappeared for a few years, then got nabbed for an assault in a movie theater and spent his 20s in and out of prison. Who knew how much destruction Red had caused over the course of his life? Continuation of this story in the next video, as well as many other exciting stories you can see on the channel.